What if I told you that 24 girls were never lost because they were never allowed to leave? They're still here, not as children, not as bodies, but as whispers, embedded in walls, in bones beneath bricks, in ash scattered beneath rose bushes planted by hands pretending to be holy. Their names were erased, their lives traded, their memories buried beneath a cathedral of lies, dressed in lace and liturgy. This is not a ghost story. This is a story about predators who wore the robes of saints, about the machinery of silence, greased by donations and veiled behind stained glass, about the places society builds to protect the vulnerable while feeding them to the wolves. And it starts not in screams, but in obedience. In the winter of 1851, Elizabeth Hartwell was a schoolteacher, plain, proper, Protestant, and naive to the horrors that pulse beneath institutions built on virtue. She believed in God, in duty, in the American ideal that orphan children deserved mercy. But on a gray morning, beneath St. Catherine's Academy for Young Ladies, Elizabeth peeled back a false wall and stepped into the one place she never should have entered. What she found wasn't just a room, it was a sentence. 24 iron bed frames bolted to stone, shackles rusted shut, scraps of dolls, ribbons, hair, and on the wall, in a child's trembling hand, "We are still here." Elizabeth told the truth. She wrote it down. She risked everything. And the world buried her alive without ever touching a shovel. The church silenced it. The state filed it away. And for over a century, nobody ever asked why 24 girls had simply ceased to exist. Until now. Before this video ends, you'll understand why no girl ever wrote home, why no photograph survived, why bones were burned instead of buried, and why those 3 women who wore habits and spoke of heaven were nothing but architects of a hell built for profit, pleasure, and power. This is your only warning. The deeper we go, the harder it becomes to come back. Next comes the descent. In 1834, Salem was already a place heavy with ghosts. The witch trials had passed into legend, but the soil still reeked of judgment, of girls condemned for speaking out, for being different, for being too much or too little of something men couldn't understand. That's what made Gallows Hill Road the perfect place to hide a lie behind virtue. On the surface, St. Catherine's Academy was salvation wrapped in Gothic brick and scripture. The promotional leaflets described a sanctuary for orphaned girls, Christian refinement, moral instruction, placement with God-fearing families. But the devil doesn't come wearing horns. He comes quoting scripture with blood on his hands and a smile behind the veil. The woman who named herself Mother Superior Victoria Whitman was neither mother, nor superior, nor a servant of God. She was a strategist, a predator clothed in the vestments of grace. She arrived in Salem with forged papers, false credentials, and the kind of presence that made mayors feel honored and ministers feel humbled. Tall, severe, with a gaze that silenced rooms and a voice cultured in the accent of Boston's elite. She spoke about her calling with the fervor of a savior. But her faith was not in God, it was in power. She knew that society loves to praise the virtuous, but never verifies them. She was joined by 2 others, Sister Margaret Collins and Sister Agnes Murphy, to the public. They formed a holy trinity of maternal care, Margaret with her soft Irish lilt, the warmth of a hearth in winter, Agnes with the discipline of a nun forged in iron, managing schedules, money, and punishment with equal precision. They said they were devoted to lifting young girls out of despair. But no one asked where those girls were lifted to. No one noticed that while new arrivals kept coming, No one ever left. Not to Boston, not to families, not to freedom. The state was grateful. The church was impressed. The community was relieved. And the girls? The girls were swallowed whole by a system built to digest them. Salem didn't want to know, and so it didn't. But silence is never neutral. It's complicity wrapped in comfort. And that silence would allow a 13-year reign of terror to unfold beneath a cross. A habit, and a lie so convincing it took a century to crack. We begin there, not at the surface, but at the rot beneath the altar. Because when evil wears a halo, it takes more than faith to see it. The girls came from ashes, burned out tenements, factories gone up in smoke, cholera wards, and unmarked graves. They came in silence, packed into carriages by grief-stricken neighbors or distant cousins too poor to keep them. Mary O'Brien was 13 when the fire took her parents. Sarah Thompson, 15, lost everything in a single week to consumption. Catherine Murphy was 12, her mother broken by poverty after her father's body was found beside the tracks. Each girl arrived like a blank page, told she'd be written into a better story. What they didn't know was that their pages would be torn out, crumpled, and buried beneath the very floors they were promised would shelter them. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss. The girls wore modest gray dresses, white aprons, and obedient smiles. They sang hymns. They studied scripture and domestic arts. They learned to clean, sew, and speak only when spoken to. Visitors rare and carefully chosen saw order, not horror. They saw neat dormitories, devout women, and girls who bowed their heads at every grace. But they didn't see the locked third floor. They didn't see the basement workshop that was always suspiciously empty during tours. And they never asked why, year after year. No girl ever wrote back, came back, or was seen in society again. Behind the order was a system. The academy ran on fear disguised as discipline, on rituals that broke the will masked as moral training. Every movement of the girls was catalogued, every expression monitored. Disobedience was met not with correction, but with isolation, starvation, and pain. What was presented as routine was, in fact, psychological warfare, a slow conditioning that taught these children that obedience meant survival, and survival was no longer a guarantee, but a reward meted out to those who complied most completely. No one asked where the girls went when they graduated. No one noticed that their names disappeared from every known record. The same families that supposedly adopted them never appeared in public. No marriage certificates, no death notices, no letters, no sightings. Just absence and erasure too perfect to be coincidence. And still, the people of Salem believed the facade, because it was easier, because the truth would mean admitting that evil hadn't vanished with the witch trials. It had only learned to kneel. The first fracture in the illusion didn't come from within the academy, but from the outside, a seamstress named Emma Prescott, who had once worked beside Mary O'Brien in a textile mill before tragedy stole Mary's family. Years had passed since they'd spoken. But grief doesn't forget the voices it once soothed. On a gray February morning in 1843, Emma was walking through Boston's North End when she heard it soft, haunting, and unmistakable. A lullaby, cracked and tired, drifting from a second-story window in one of the city's filthiest districts. The voice was Mary's. Not a memory, not a ghost. Mary alive, or something like it behind the curtains of a known brothel. Dressed in silks that no orphan could afford, her hair curled like a socialite's, her expression hollow as a shell. Emma froze. The song didn't. It spilled from the window like a wound that refused to close. The man at the door warned her away with the kind of smile that hides broken teeth and threats behind good manners. That night, Emma wrote a letter to the academy, hoping for an explanation, a denial, even a lie that made sense. Instead, she received a response from Sister Agnes that felt like a hand gripping her throat in ink. Mary, she said, had been placed with a fine Christian family in western Massachusetts years ago. They preferred privacy. She was thriving. She didn't wish to be contacted. It read like a eulogy written by someone who'd never seen the body. But Emma was a seamstress. She saw details others missed. The letter was written in 2 different hands, most of it in Sister Agnes's careful script. But the signature was rushed, clumsy, almost panicked. Something was wrong. And when Emma saw Sarah Thompson, another girl from the academy, being led through Faneuil Hall by a well-dressed man with dead eyes and a carriage waiting, her dread became certainty. The girl didn't speak, didn't resist. But her eyes locked with Emma's for a second, and they screamed. Emma wrote again, this time more directly. And the reply she got wasn't from Agnes. It was from Mother Superior Whitman herself. Cold, dismissive, threatening. Young women who pursue matters that do not concern them often find their own safety and reputation may be called into question. A warning wrapped in civility. Emma understood exactly what it meant. And so should you. Emma Prescott was no fool. She knew that letter wasn't just a warning, it was a contract. An invisible signature on the dotted line of silence, offering her a chance to step back before the storm consumed her. But some truths, once glimpsed, cannot be unseen, and some consciences, however fragile, refuse to sleep when the world demands they close their eyes. Emma had seen 2 girls who were supposed to be safe, placed with Christian families, walking in shadows and wearing expressions carved from trauma. And behind their eyes, something worse than pain resignation. She knew she was being watched. The man at the carriage stop, the silent figure outside her boarding house. The letter that had arrived opened, resealed. The ink inside blurred as if someone had read it in the rain. But fear, in Emma, did not produce silence, it produced clarity. She contacted a friend who worked in the Boston Police Department, quietly, cautiously. A detective named William Ashworth, known for poking his nose into corners too dusty for most men. She didn't tell him everything, just enough to light a match and toss it into the dark. Ashworth was already watching. A pattern had begun to emerge in his reports, girls missing from orphanages. No bodies, no follow-ups, no inquiries. He hadn't yet connected the dots, but Emma gave him the thread. Together, they began to cross-reference names, timelines, and known brothel networks operating beneath the sheen of Boston's elite society. What they found wasn't a fluke. It was a system, institutional, meticulous, repeating the same pattern over and over with religious precision. Orphaned girl arrives. Girl disappears. No records, no visits, just silence. But to prove anything, Ashworth would need more than suspicion. He would need evidence, witnesses, paper trails, names, and someone willing to risk everything to provide them. That someone came not in uniform, not from a church pew, not from law or justice or moral duty. She came bleeding, trembling, and desperate in a black habit torn down the back. Her face bruised by hands she once trusted. She came to Ashworth's door on a night that changed everything. And she wasn't a nun. She wasn't even Margaret. She was Martha, and she was ready to confess. Martha Caldwell sat shaking in Ashworth's parlor, her blood-stained habit a costume unraveling by the minute. Her voice, once soft with a feigned Irish lilt, had flattened into the raw accent of a Massachusetts mill town. She didn't bother with piety anymore. No prayers, no titles, just truth, pouring from a mouth that had been sealed too long. "We weren't nuns," she said. "None of us. We were thieves, grifters, killers. We stole the habits off the dead. And with that, the dam broke." The lie was bigger than anyone had imagined. It hadn't started with charity, it had started with murder. The real nuns, 3 of them, had arrived in Boston from Ireland with hopes of founding a Catholic orphanage. Victoria Whitman had been waiting. She, Martha, and Agnes had read about their mission in a regional paper. They met the women off the ship with warm smiles and false devotion, offered to escort them safely to Salem. And somewhere along a wooded road near Marblehead, they beat them, strangled them, and buried their bodies in an unmarked grave. The habits were taken, the church documents forged. The academy they built wasn't an orphanage, it was a factory, a machine that processed innocence into currency, and every inch of it had been designed by Victoria. Martha hadn't planned on becoming a monster. At least, that's what she told Ashworth at first. "We thought we'd just run a scam," she whispered. "Take the church's money, fake a few adoptions, disappear in a few years." But Victoria, she saw something else. It was Victoria who realized that no one asked questions about orphans. That girls with no family had no protectors, no inheritance, no paper trail. They could be molded, exploited, erased. And in a society desperate to keep the streets clean and its conscience clear, no one would ever look deeper than the smiling faces in the Academy's portraits. Martha described everything. How girls were selected based on beauty, silence, and obedience. How they were trained in secret rooms. How clients were vetted not for morals, but for money. And how, when a girl became inconvenient through defiance, disease, or despair, she was retired. The euphemism had haunted Martha for years. Retirement meant a trip to the basement. It meant Agnes. It meant ashes in the furnace and names scratched out of ledgers like they had never existed. "There were 24, she said finally, her voice cracking. 24 we named as our best, our most profitable, our most obedient. And every one of them was burned." Ashworth listened in silence, the weight of Martha's confession pressing on his chest like a coffin lid. He had expected depravity. He had prepared himself for cruelty. But what Martha described wasn't just abuse. It was industry. The Academy was a cathedral of exploitation, sanctified not by God, but by profit, built brick by brick from the bones of the forgotten. Each girl had a value assigned, not in grades or virtues, but in how much a man would pay to touch her. There were ledgers, catalogs, requests, and behind it all, Victoria Whitman, a woman who played the role of savior while running one of the most sophisticated trafficking operations in the Northeast. The system was efficient. New girls were isolated upon arrival, tested for obedience, fed lies about loving families and bright futures while being starved of affection and rest. They were broken down systematically, and those who resisted were not punished publicly. They were made examples in the places no one saw. There was a room beneath the basement, hidden behind barrels and crates, where Sister Agnes taught what she called discipline for the difficult. Martha had been there once. She never returned. The screams didn't sound like children. They sounded like animals caught in a trap. Voices mangled beyond recognition by pain and confusion. That was where Catherine Murphy died. The girls who graduated were sold. That was the word used. Sold. Sometimes to wealthy patrons under the pretense of adoption. Sometimes to private clubs, where masked men paid to watch innocents vanish behind locked doors. Martha confessed to forging the documents, preparing the girls, even administering the laudanum that made them easier to control. We told ourselves they were better off than starving in the streets, she said, shaking. We told ourselves the world was already cruel. We were just choosing where they suffered. But she knew the truth. They hadn't saved anyone. They had devoured them. Ashworth didn't speak until the end. His hands trembled, not from fear but fury, the kind that burns cold, the kind that doesn't scream, but promises. He asked one question, "Do you know where the ledger is?" Martha nodded. "It's in Victoria's quarters, behind the altar. There's a hollow panel in the wall. Everything's in there, names, payments, photographs." She kept it like a priest keeps scripture, proof of her dominion. Ashworth stood, because now he had everything he needed, and war, once declared in silence, was about to be made public. Ashworth moved like a man possessed, not reckless, not loud, but methodical, like someone planting explosives in the foundations of a building he planned to collapse, with Martha's map of the academy etched into his memory. He contacted the only lawmen he could trust, federal marshals and 2 officers from the Massachusetts State Police who owed him favors from old cases. He didn't involve his own department. He couldn't. The reach of the academy, and of the men funding it, had already twisted too many arms and bought too many mouths. The raid would happen at dawn, quiet, surgical, but decisive. And when the sun rose over Salem on November 16th, 1847, it revealed not a sanctuary, but a tomb. They entered through the front and the basement simultaneously. The nuns, if you could still call them that, were caught off guard. Agnes was found by the furnace, ash-streaked and frantic, trying to burn what few remaining records hadn't already been locked away. Victoria wasn't in her room. She had been tipped off by someone with power, someone who understood what was at stake and was found attempting to flee across the northern border with a carriage full of gold and silence. But her pride betrayed her. She took the ledger. She couldn't bear the thought of it being out of her hands. It was her gospel, her monument to control. That mistake sealed her fate. Inside the hollow panel behind the Academy's chapel altar, they found the vault. It was real. Everything Martha had promised, and more. Ledgers bound in calfskin, each entry scrawled in elegant, merciless ink, names of clients, dates, prices, physical descriptions of the girls, their qualities, and the fate they met once they ceased to please. The youngest listed was 11, the oldest, just 17. Some had stars next to their names, exceptional obedience, high repeat value, deceased retired with dignity. Those stars made Ashworth's blood boil. Dignity. What dignity was there in cremation behind a false wall? The photographs were the worst. Faded. Some torn, others stained by time or blood. Girls dressed in silk, their eyes vacant, their smiles forced, mouths painted to look older than they were, and among them, tucked into a smaller envelope, were pictures of men, clients, politicians, priests, businessmen, smiling with the girls as if they were daughters or trophies. It was no longer a question of guilt. It was a matter of how deep the rot went and how far those in power would go to bury it again. The backlash was immediate and not in the way Ashworth expected. The morning after the raid, Salem's local paper ran a modest column about irregularities found at St. Catherine's Academy. Buried beneath updates on livestock prices and shipping schedules. No mention of the furnace, no mention of the ledger. Just a vague suggestion that mismanagement and clerical confusion had necessitated a temporary closure. Ashworth knew what it meant. The cover-up had begun. The names in that ledger weren't just men, they were pillars. Judges, bishops, mayors, and merchants who had built their reputations on morality while feeding on children behind velvet doors. These men weren't going to let one detective rewrite their history. 2 days later, Ashworth was summoned to a closed-door meeting at City Hall. Present were 5 officials, all older men, their suits crisp, their eyes dull with calculation. They didn't threaten him directly. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they spoke in tones of concern for his reputation, his future, his safety. They asked if he might consider reinterpreting some of the findings. Perhaps the girls had died of illness. Perhaps the ledger had been a forgery. Perhaps Martha Caldwell had acted alone, driven by madness or guilt. It was, after all, a sensitive matter. They reminded him that hysteria helped no one, that accusations could destroy good men and unravel the delicate social fabric that held their community together. Ashworth didn't respond. He simply stood, handed them a copy of the photograph showing Judge Harrison Cromwell, their colleague smiling beside a girl who had disappeared 6 months later, and walked out. That night, someone tried to break into his home. He sat by the door with a rifle and a bottle of whiskey until dawn, knowing full well that if they wanted him dead, they'd wait until the story faded from public view. But Ashworth wasn't going to give them that chance. He contacted journalists in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. He sent copies of the ledger to every editor, every priest who hadn't been bought, every woman's society and reform group he could find. And then he waited. But before the storm broke, before the papers could publish, before the public could rage, one thing had to happen. The truth had to be spoken aloud, publicly, with no retreat. And it had to come from Martha, because if the dead were to be remembered, it had to begin with the living confessing what they'd done. Martha Caldwell took the stand in a packed courtroom that smelled of sweat, ink, and dread. She was pale, thinner than the woman who had first knocked on Ashworth's door, but steadier now, as if confession had stripped away the weight of pretending. No longer Sister Margaret, no longer accomplice cloaked in sanctity. She spoke not as a victim, nor as a monster seeking pity, but as a witness to horror, a woman finally willing to burn the temple she helped build. Her testimony lasted 3 days, and, during that time, not a single person in that room truly breathed. She named every girl she could remember. She described their faces, their cries, their final moments. She described how Agnes liked to hum hymns while preparing the furnace, how Victoria called the ledgers her book of saints, how the clients paid extra for photos, for silence, for the comfort of being untouchable. But the courtroom didn't erupt in outrage. It froze in place. The accusations were too vast, too monstrous to process all at once. Men in the audience shifted in their seats, eyes darting as if afraid their own names might be next. Women wept. A priest fainted. The judge tried to maintain decorum, but his hands trembled every time a new name was read aloud. When Martha produced one of the smaller ledgers from Victoria's safe pages, annotated with payment amounts next to initials that corresponded to prominent city officials, the courtroom reached a boiling point. It was no longer just a criminal trial. It was a reckoning. Outside, protests began, first in Salem, then Boston, then as far as Providence and Albany. People lit candles and left ribbons at the academy's gates. Others broke windows. Graffiti appeared overnight. "We are still here," the same words written in that basement, scratched by a child whose name no one had ever spoken until now. Parents clutched their children tighter. School teachers quit their posts in religious institutions. Donations dried up. Churches emptied. And for the first time in decades, the powerful felt hunted. But power doesn't die quietly. It recoils. It retaliates. The newspapers that had promised to print the full story suddenly went silent, bought out or threatened. 2 journalists vanished. A Reform Society's building burned down. And then came the deaths, suicides, mostly. Cromwell was first, then 2 priests, then a senator's secretary. Each one had ties to the ledger. Each one had a reason to fear what might still be uncovered. Ashworth watched it all, knowing this was only the beginning. The trials should have shattered the world. They should have reset the moral compass of a nation, dragged the buried into daylight, and built protections that could never be undone. But that's not how systems work. Systems don't fall because they're exposed, they adapt. Rebrand, rewire. Ashworth realized this the moment the first appeal was filed, not by a defendant, but by a group of influential businessmen claiming that the case unfairly targeted Catholic institutions. They framed it as religious persecution, as an attack on charity. And slowly, methodically, the narrative began to shift not toward justice for the girls, but toward the reputations of men who'd built empires on their suffering. Agnes Murphy tried to feign diminished capacity, slurring her speech, pretending to forget names and timelines. But the evidence was too overwhelming. The photographs, the furnace, the ledger, there was no room for plausible denial. She was sentenced to death by hanging. So was Victoria Wittmann, who never once broke character. She maintained her dignity like a queen awaiting exile, claiming innocence even as she read scripture during the verdict. "I have only served God," she said, "and protected his children." The words turned to acid in the courtroom. One juror wept openly. Another had to be escorted out. But the sentence stood. And yet, as the dates approached, delays mounted, legal loopholes, missing paperwork, last-minute petitions from clergy who still believed these women to be misunderstood martyrs. Ashworth knew what was happening. The machinery was grinding forward again, wheels greased with wealth and fear. There were whispers that the execution would be postponed indefinitely, that someone high up had reservations about the optics. And more troubling still, that new institutions were quietly opening in other towns under different names, managed by different faces, but built on the same rot. He began receiving anonymous letters, descriptions of facilities in Connecticut, in New Jersey, even in Washington, D.C., places where orphans were once again being reformed in silence. He knelt by the earth where the furnace once stood and placed 24 white stones in a circle. No names carved, no eulogy spoken, just silence, the kind that listens, the kind that remembers. Because if the system would not mourn them, he would. The public appetite for justice faded faster than Ashworth anticipated. People who had once shouted in the streets with candles and fists now shifted their attention elsewhere, to elections, to economic downturns, to new scandals more palatable than a ledger of raped and murdered girls. even the most grotesque truths. He learned. Have an expiration date in the collective mind. It was easier to forget than to integrate what had been uncovered. Easier to believe it was an anomaly, a single bad apple, a rogue institution rather than a reflection of the festering core. But Ashworth couldn't forget. The ledger sat on his desk like a corpse that refused to rot, its pages growing heavier with each passing day. He started making copies, not just physical ones, but mental. He memorized the names, dates, patterns, not because he feared the originals would be destroyed, though they might, but because he wanted the story to live in someone who could not be bribed or burned. Himself. The records pointed to men who were still walking free, men who sat in pews on Sundays and shook hands at city halls. Ashworth tried to pass the information up the chain, but the responses came cloaked in deflection, insufficient evidence. Priorities elsewhere. Public trust must be preserved. And always. The same warning in different words, let it go. But letting go would have meant turning his back on the 24 girls whose names the state still refused to engrave in stone, even in death. They weren't granted personhood. No official memorial, no state acknowledgement, just whispers in archive rooms and footnotes in legal documents marked sealed by order of the court. Ashworth began compiling a private dossier, thousands of pages. Not just of St. Catherine's, but of every academy, home, and mission that fit the same pattern. And what he found confirmed the worst the model had been replicated, not just in Massachusetts, but across the eastern seaboard. Different names, same architecture, same ledger format, same silent walls. He confronted clergy. He met with former staff. He followed paper trails that led to shell companies and private train cars carrying children under the guise of adoption. And each time he got close, someone else went missing. A clerk in Albany, a former academy matron in Baltimore, a midwife in Rhode Island. Silence was enforced not with ropes, but with bureaucracy and threat. But Ashworth wasn't afraid anymore. He'd already been marked. The only question now was how deep he was willing to dig and what he was willing to lose. The deeper Ashworth went, the less he recognized the world around him. Or maybe, he thought, the veil had simply been lifted. Every courthouse, every cathedral, every institution that claimed to serve the vulnerable began to look like another mask, each one polished, perfumed, and quietly rotting. He started seeing the same architectural signatures, the same cross-referenced shipping manifests, the same handwritten correspondence from so-called benefactors, all pointing to a singular. Terrifying truth, son. Catherine's hadn't been an outlier. It was a template, a blueprint perfected by monsters who understood something most people couldn't stomach, that if you wrap horror in charity, the world will fund it, praise it, protect it. And they had, for decades. He followed one such thread to Connecticut, to a former textile mill that had been repurposed into a girls' rehabilitation home, officially. It was run by a Protestant mission group, unofficially. It was another furnace wearing a smile. He posed as a benefactor this time, using a fake name and credentials obtained through a colleague who still believed in the work. Inside, it was clean, modest, and dead behind the eyes. The girls moved in perfect silence, not from discipline, but from learned fear. Their eyes tracked every movement, not like children, but like animals waiting for the cage to slam shut. And when Ashworth asked to see the record book, the director hesitated for just a second too long. That hesitation told him everything. He returned that night through a back window, careful not to leave a trace. In the office safe, beneath a false floorboard, was a ledger. Not as extensive as St. Catherine's, but familiar. Too familiar. Names, ages, prices, and beside a few of them, a faint mark, a triangle with 3 dots. Ashworth hadn't seen it before. It wasn't in Martha's records. But it appeared again and again in facilities across New England, hidden in margins, sometimes in invisible ink. A symbol, a sigil, a language of predators that whispered, "This one belongs to the network." That was when he realized it wasn't just a network of locations. It was a brotherhood, a society that had adapted its methods over generations, protected by bloodlines, influence, and shared sin. The record stretched back to the early 1800s, some even older, and among the client names, Ashworth began to see patterns that sent chills through his bones. The same surnames appeared in politics, finance, and church leadership today. This wasn't ancient history, it was legacy. And the families who funded it still walked the halls of power, still smiled for portraits, still sat in pews, still knew what had been done. Ashworth didn't sleep much after that. He began pinning names and faces on the wall of his study like a war map string running between institutions. Ledgers, old photos, cemetery plots, and sealed court documents that had somehow never seen trial. It wasn't paranoia, it was pattern. These weren't isolated crimes committed by desperate men. They were rituals, generational, passed down like heirlooms behind closed doors in ivy-covered homes. There were rules, initiations, and codes, and every few decades, the operation was cleaned, rebranded, and relocated. The same evil, dressed in new uniforms, always hiding behind the same justification: charity, order, tradition. One night, while reviewing the ledger from the Connecticut facility, Ashworth came across something that hadn't shown up before: a name with no date, no payment, no notation, just a single word beside it, written in red ink instead of black seed. He found it again in 3 other ledgers, always red, always beside girls under the age of 13, and always with a client initialed HS, a man who, Ashworth would later learn, had died in 1898 with a statue in his honor still standing outside the Boston Public Library. The word chilled him more than anything else in the records, not because of what it meant outright, but because of what it suggested. Seed didn't mean sale. It meant use, breeding, reproduction. It was no longer just about trafficking or abuse. It was about lineage. The network hadn't just consumed children. It had created them. Ashworth's hands trembled as he read further. The pages didn't speak plainly. This level of depravity had its own language. But the implication was clear. Certain girls were chosen not for clients, but for bloodlines, to bear children, off the books, erased from society before they ever took a breath, born into captivity, raised as products, and, if deemed exceptional, used to seed the next generation of servants and subjects. He closed the book and stared into the mirror for a long time that night. Not because he feared for his life. That fear had passed. But because he saw in his own face the shadow of complicity, not in action, but in delay. He had believed for too long that justice was a matter of procedure. That truth, once revealed, would correct the course. But truth, he now knew, was only a threat if someone acted on it, and if no one did. It became just another ghost buried alongside the girls who never got to be women. Their bones scattered across the soil of institutions still called holy, Ashworth made his choice in silence. He understood now that there would be no sweeping prosecution, no grand reckoning, no moment where the world paused to cry out for the girls whose names had been turned into ciphers. What he carried wasn't a case anymore. It was a curse, a burden of knowing. And with that burden came clarity. If the system wouldn't hold itself accountable, then it had to be bled from the inside, patiently, relentlessly, one artery at a time. He began feeding documents, anonymously, to people he knew would never let go: investigative reporters, radical reformers, fringe archivists who were already half banished from academia. He gave them just enough to provoke obsession, but never enough to trace it back to him. He stopped chasing indictments. Instead, he chased fractures, places where the mask slipped, where the facade of benevolence cracked enough for questions to creep in. He leaked records that showed suspicious donation flows to certain churches. He pointed journalists toward orphanages whose alumni lists contained more missing persons than graduates. He sabotaged inspections from within by forging health complaints, smuggling in photographs, fabricating anonymous tips that forced even the most compromised officials to take a second glance. Most of the time, the results were small. A facility closed quietly, a bishop reassigned, a donor retreating into silence. But it added up, not to justice, but to erosion. He returned to Marblehead once, years after the trials. The field where the 3 real nuns had been buried was now a stretch of weeds and silence. No marker, no fence, as if the earth itself had chosen to forget. But Ashworth hadn't. He knelt and pressed his hand to the soil, whispering an apology that no one heard. Not for failing to save them, he'd never had that power, but for believing, even for a moment, that the world wanted them saved. The truth was simpler, uglier. Most people didn't care, not really. They cared about comfort, about illusions of goodness. The moment the truth became inconvenient, it became a burden they would gladly let rot. But some burdens are meant to be carried, not to be healed, or resolved, or forgiven, but remembered, etched into the marrow of a man who chooses to see the world as it is, not as it pretends to be. And Ashworth, though older now, knew this evil thrives on forgetting, on the turning of the page, on the next news cycle. That's why he kept writing, every day, every night, names, dates, maps, until the walls of his home bled history, until no one could say it had been hidden. By 1853, 6 years after the fall of St. Catherine's, Ashworth was no longer seen as a hero. He'd become a ghost in his own precinct, a man colleagues avoided in hallways, whose presence made people nervous. Promotions passed him over. His reports were delayed, misplaced, or returned with red ink and polite rebukes. The brass called him obsessed, unstable, compromised. But what truly disturbed them wasn't his persistence, it was his refusal to forget. He never allowed the department to wash its hands of the blood it once ignored. He kept the girls' faces on his office wall long after the case had gone cold, long after the paperwork had been boxed and filed under resolved. And he spoke their names aloud every morning, like a prayer no church dared recite. Then came the boy. He was 9, barefoot, half-starved, found wandering along the edge of a rail yard in Lowell. Said he'd escaped from a school, but couldn't name it. He had bruises and patterns that told Ashworth everything he needed to know, lines that matched ropes. Not false. His back was lashed. His eyes barely blinked. And on his inner wrist, beneath grime and dried blood, was a faint mark, a triangle, 3 dots. Ashworth felt his heart sink like lead into a pit that never had a bottom. The boy had been born inside it, the system. The very one Ashworth had spent years trying to shatter. And if there was one, there were more. Ashworth tried to trace the child's past. Every record led to dead ends. The adoption papers were forged. The birth certificate had no issuing county. The boy's story came out in fragments, dreams, nightmares, slips of the tongue when he thought no one was listening. A place with no windows, men with masks, chants, cold water. A woman who called herself mother, but smelled like soap and vinegar and fear. It wasn't just trafficking anymore. It was something older, something ritualistic. And that market wasn't just a code for property. It was a symbol, ancient and intentional. The case reignited Ashworth's fire. He moved the boy to a safe house under a false name, cut contact with most of his colleagues, and began digging not just through ledgers, but through grimoires, Masonic manuals, and obscure religious archives. The deeper he went, the clearer it became. This wasn't just exploitation, it was doctrine, codified, practiced, hidden in plain sight beneath layers of charity, discipline, and God's will. And the moment you saw it clearly, you could never look at power the same way again. The symbol triangle with 3 dots appeared in more places than Ashworth anticipated. It wasn't just in ledgers. It surfaced in the margins of private seminary records, etched into cornerstones of old orphan asylums, and even stitched into the lining of ceremonial vestments donated to elite churches. He began to map it, and the results were chilling. The triangle traced not geography, but hierarchy, a power structure encoded through centuries, one that operated beneath empires, churches, and courts alike. He found references in obscure Vatican correspondence, in early Puritan documents marked heretical, and even in pre-colonial trade ledgers involving the transfer of servants from Europe to the New World. It wasn't just American. It wasn't even just Christian. It was older, much older. A philosophy passed like a disease between civilizations, that children were vessels, and that purity was currency. Ashworth documented everything. He began filling not notebooks, but trunks, thousands of pages, sketches, timelines, at night. He dreamed of staircases spiraling into stone basements with no end, of voices whispering numbers in forgotten tongues, of children with mouths sewn shut, humming hymns that never existed. He stopped trusting clocks. He stopped trusting shadows. And yet, he wasn't paranoid. He was aware. What terrified him most wasn't the rituals, or the abuses, or even the global scale. It was the elegance, the efficiency, the way this machinery adapted across cultures, always finding new justification, new robes, new oaths. Sometimes it wore the cross, sometimes the crescent, sometimes the seal of a nation, always the same mechanics beneath. He knew he couldn't expose it all, not in one lifetime, but he could ignite something, a contagion of awareness. He began leaking fragments of what he'd found to outsiders, not authorities, but outliers, spiritual dissidents, underground newspapers, esoteric researchers. Most dismissed him as mad. A few listened, and of those, fewer still understood. But that was enough, because an idea, once planted, does not need approval to grow. It needs silence to die, and Ashworth would no longer offer silence. He visited the boy one last time before vanishing from Boston entirely, left him in the care of a woman who had once escaped a convent in Quebec with her sanity barely intact. "Don't raise him to be good," Ashworth told her. "Raise him to see." Then he disappeared into New Hampshire's backcountry with his ledgers, his trunk, and a vow carved into memory: we are still here. Not just the girls, but the watchers, the ones who remember what the world wants forgotten. Years passed. Ashworth became a myth whispered about in basements, referenced in margins of banned books and old newspaper archives under headlines like "Detective Vanishes After Controversial Trial." The world moved on, or at least pretended to. St. Catherine's was demolished. The land eventually converted into a children's park, ironic, almost cruel. In its placement, the swing sets cast shadows where the furnace once burned. Parents smiled, unaware of the soil beneath their feet, soil that still whispered, if you listened close enough, in voices too light for the wind to carry. The girls were gone. Yes, but the hunger that consumed them was not. It had merely changed its mask. The network, stripped of its most public face, reorganized. Its members shifted to new charities, new schools, new missions under different denominations. It was not dismantled. It was decentralized. The beauty of rot is that it doesn't need a single trunk to spread. It moves through roots, silent. Beneath everything, Ashworth had uncovered only a limb of the beast. What lay beyond, in Europe, in South America, in colonies where the word mission still meant dominion, remained intact. The only difference now was that fewer dared to look. After all, the price of knowing was exile, or worse. But his work didn't die with his absence. A strange thing began to happen. People started receiving packages, no return address, no explanation. Inside photographs, fragments of the ledger, pages with names and symbols, annotations in Ashworth's unmistakable hand. Always sent to those most likely to dig deeper, historians fired for asking the wrong questions. Activists with criminal records. Midwives who knew what trauma looked like in a newborn's eyes. The packages were seeds. And from them sprouted whispers. Articles appeared in fringe journals. Anonymous pamphlets circulated among underground circles. Preachers were interrupted during sermons by women holding up copies of aged photographs, asking why their sister never came home. Still, the system held. It always held, because it was too deeply rooted in the scaffolding of power. But something had shifted. The silence was no longer total. There were echoes now. A phrase repeated at protests, painted on alley walls in blood-red chalk. Whispered during late-night radio broadcasts, barely audible but unmistakable. We are still here, not just the dead, but the aware, the watchers, the ones willing to descend into the dark, not for salvation, but for truth. By the spring of 1861, the world had bigger fires to fan. War loomed, and the nation's gaze turned inward toward states, borders, politics soaked in blood and pride. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. In chaos, predators thrive. Institutions once under scrutiny were left alone, their paper trails buried beneath the smoldering rhetoric of unity and division. Several of the names from Ashworth's ledgers rose to prominence during this period, cloaked in patriotism, philanthropy, or faith. One became a senator, another helped fund military hospitals, another rebranded his foundation as an agency for reformed youth and received government contracts to house displaced children during the war. Ashworth, had he still been visible, might have screamed, but his silence now was strategy. The packages continued. Some found their way into the hands of soldiers, others to nurses, others to escaped slaves whose stories held shadows too similar to those etched into the faces of the orphaned girls. The trauma wasn't confined to one race or faith or geography. The pattern was wider, older. And Ashworth had come to believe that the real war wasn't between states, but between those who consume innocence and those who protect it. The battlefield just happened to wear a different uniform now. In a journal found decades later in a cave near the White Mountains, believed to have belonged to Ashworth, a single passage was scrawled over and over across the last few pages. There is no system more powerful than one that feeds on the bodies of the forgotten and calls it mercy. He had begun studying ancient legal codes, Roman orphanage structures, medieval monastic orders, Babylonian temple hierarchies, all of them featuring a version of the same cycle: take the unwanted, label them divine property, and erase them in plain sight. What St. Thomas and Catherine's had done was not new. It was perfected repetition. The journal also included drawings, diagrams of symbols, some resembling religious sigils, others closer to alchemical scripts, but always, somewhere, the triangle with 3 dots. Ashworth seemed convinced that it wasn't just a mark of ownership. It was a warning, a signal between the initiated, like a watermark for the elite predator class, wherever it appeared. Children disappeared, records went missing, land changed hands, and the world moved on without blinking. Ashworth's disappearance eventually became a story in itself, twisted, denied, retold in a dozen conflicting versions. Some claimed he'd gone mad, wandered into the woods, and starved, clutching ledgers like sacred texts. Others said he'd been silenced, his body dumped in a river and his life erased from department records like he'd never worn a badge. But among those who understood what he'd uncovered, a different rumor grew, that he'd embedded himself within the system not to protect it, but to dismantle it from within. That the packages still appearing decades later bore handwriting no archivist could match. Ink that had aged slower than it should. Parchment too modern to be from the 1800s, yet written in his cadence, as if he'd become something more than a man, a myth armed with receipts. Regardless of the truth, his work continued to resurface. In 1874, during a renovation of a burned-out chapel in Albany, a mason found a sealed iron box behind a false altar wall. Inside were records bearing Ashworth's notes, photographs, correspondences, names of prominent families whose descendants still held office. One letter contained a hand-drawn map connecting former orphan homes across the Northeast, with the phrase scrawled across the top in crimson, "We do not forget what they made of us." The mason turned the box over to police. The next day, he was found dead at the bottom of the renovation site. Ruled an accident, the box was never entered into evidence. It was the pattern all over again. Discover, disappear, deny, repeat. But a few began to notice. In New York, a school teacher uncovered old records of a girls' academy that had burned mysteriously in 1842, 22 girls listed as transferred. But no receiving school on file. In Pennsylvania, a cemetery groundskeeper found unmarked graves beneath a section of land never officially zoned for burials. Graves the city insisted had always been decorative landscaping. The more people dug, the more they found the same 3 constants: silence, symbols, and fire. Always the fire, as if the past itself had to be burned for the future to remain blind. But not everyone looked away. A quiet network began to form: educators, midwives, librarians, undertakers, those who saw the signs and chose to keep records in secret, not organized, not armed, but watching, waiting. Ashworth had sown something deeper than evidence. He had planted memory, and in certain circles, his name was no longer a warning. It was a vow. By the turn of the century, St. Catherine's was a ghost only the land remembered, but its legacy, the darkness it refined and exported, had metastasized into new institutions with polished reputations and state funding. Reformatories, homes for wayward youth, adoption bureaus run by philanthropic societies whose board members bore the same surnames found in Ashworth's ledgers. These weren't coincidental overlaps. They were reincarnations, paper-thin transformations that allowed the same machinery to operate under the banner of progress. The girls were now boys, too. The robes became suits, the crosses replaced with state seals, and the public, as always, turned its eyes away, comforted by brochures printed in gold leaf and promises spoken in the language of care. But something strange began happening in those new institutions. Some of the children started remembering things they shouldn't have known: names, places, phrases whispered in dreams. "We are still here." Social workers dismissed it as trauma manifesting in strange ways. Doctors called it shared delusion. But the files were sealed nonetheless. Teachers who tried to speak up were reassigned or removed. In one Chicago orphanage in 1906, 17 children were reported missing over the course of 2 years. The official explanation was runaway behavior. But one surviving boy, institutionalized as mentally unfit, drew the same triangular symbol on his cell wall for months before hanging himself with a bedsheet. In his final journal entry, written phonetically in a shaky hand, he wrote, "They come in sleep. They say the church never stopped. They say we are the seed." The deeper investigators, those who dared, looked. The more they found: buildings with sealed basement levels, ledgers coded in numeric keys that matched Ashworth's notes, endowments from anonymous sources tied to vanished properties in Salem and Lowell, and always, at the core, the children silent, trained to obey, never aging out. It was as if the network had learned from St. Catherine's downfall and become smarter, no longer relying on static locations, but moving between hosts, like a parasite protected by its own adaptability. But even parasites leave patterns. And Ashworth's seeds were beginning to sprout roots among those brave or broken enough to see the system for what it was. Not a relic of the past, but a living machine with gears that needed blood to turn. By 1911, copies of the St. Catherine's ledger had reached 3 foreign embassies, 2 underground presses in Berlin, and a convent in rural Spain whose abbess was rumored to be one of the original survivors. The truth was no longer confined to America. The network had spread, but so had the resistance. In 1914, as the world inched toward war, something unexpected happened. A new version of the St. Catherine's ledger surfaced, one that hadn't been seen before. This copy, bound in weathered black leather and wrapped in linen, was delivered anonymously to the British Museum in London. Inside, the names were familiar, but there were additions, foreign names, titles, not just American judges or clergymen, but aristocrats, diplomats, and financiers from across Europe. At first, the museum dismissed it as a forgery, a disturbing hoax. But a few researchers, operating in secret, cross-checked details, letters, movements. The correlations were undeniable. One scholar, a linguist named Eleanor Gray, called it the most dangerous book ever submitted to the archives. Within 6 months, she resigned, left the country, and vanished entirely. No forwarding address. Her apartment left untouched. A single phrase scrawled on the mirror in ash. They watched through the altar. That same year, Fires erupted at 3 orphanages in Belgium and France. Official reports cited electrical faults, but survivors told a different story. Men arriving at night, removing children under the guise of safe relocation, and then torching the buildings before sunrise. The symbol appeared again, carved into the base of a ruined statue outside one of the chapels, the triangle and 3 dots. Ashworth's legacy was echoing through Europe now, not as a warning, but as a battle cry. The people behind this network were reacting not because they were exposed, but because they were being tracked, hunted. Meanwhile, in America, a second generation of watchers had begun forming. Children who'd grown up with pieces of Ashworth's documents hidden beneath floorboards, tucked into Bible covers, smuggled between pages of anatomy textbooks. These weren't officials. They weren't backed by governments or churches. They were midwives, grave diggers, traveling teachers, war nurses, people who lived close to pain, who recognized when a child flinched too sharply at the word prayer or stared too long at a candle without blinking. These watchers began meeting in secret, sharing signs, stories, scars. They weren't there to fight the system. They were there to remember what it was trying to erase. And they used a phrase spoken softly, written on scraps, etched into desks, whispered into the ears of children who needed to hear it. A phrase born in the furnace room of St. Catherine's and carried across oceans by those who refused to die in silence. We are still here. It was not a plea. It was a warning. By the end of World War I, the world had seen horrors grand enough to swallow smaller ones. The trenches, the gas, the mass graves, collective trauma that rewrote the limits of suffering. But in the shadows of that war, the old machinery kept turning. Children orphaned by bombings, famine, and disease were swept into systems hastily rebuilt under humanitarian banners. International adoption bureaus, relief camps, war orphan programs, many created in good faith, but some hijacked by the same quiet network Ashworth had spent his life tracing. The chaos of war gave cover, just like before, and beneath the slogans of peace and rebirth. The ledgers opened again. The ink had changed. The accents had changed, but the symbols had not. In 1922, a nurse in Vienna, Anna Weiss, reported strange branding marks on several children transferred from a Catholic refuge in the countryside. When she attempted to investigate, she was dismissed within a week, accused of falsifying reports. She later died in a house fire ruled accidental, though locals swore they saw 2 men leaving the property minutes before it ignited. But before her death, Anna had sent a parcel to a distant cousin in Prague, an amateur historian who, years later, would publish a banned monograph titled The Doctrine of the Seed. In it, he described a belief system passed down through elite circles that certain children, when broken young enough, became vessels for something beyond control, beyond flesh. That suffering, ritualized and refined, opened doorways not to heaven, but to something far older and hungrier. Back in the States, the Watchers remained active. They had no formal name, no hierarchy, but their rituals were precise. Every member kept one child's name carved in wood beside their bed. Every member memorized one page of Ashworth's notes, passed down orally, never written. Some gathered once a year at the old park where St. Catherine's once stood, not to speak, just to sit, to remember. The city had long since forgotten what once stood there, but the Watchers had not. They still left ribbons, they still whispered, they still watched. And the network, aware now that it was being followed, grew more careful. It began investing in psychology, in social engineering, in philanthropic sciences. It funded the first waves of eugenics under the guise of public health. It shaped universities. It groomed legislators. And all the while, it buried its past deeper beneath respectability. But symbols don't rot. They wait, etched in stone, in whispers, in flesh, waiting to be read by those still willing to see. By the 1930s, the machinery of power had evolved, but its appetite had not. Institutions once masked in sanctity now draped themselves in science. Eugenics boards, mental hygiene programs, and sterilization initiatives swept across the Western world under banners of progress and purity. But beneath these sterile bureaucracies was the same logic that governed St. Catherine's, that certain lives were clay to be shaped or discarded. Orphans, the mentally ill, the poor, the inconvenient, they were studied, catalogued, moved, erased, and always. Somewhere beneath the formal language of research and policy, you could still find the triangle, sometimes hidden in the corner of a document, sometimes embossed faintly on facility doors. It no longer needed to shout. It simply existed, quietly, as proof that the old faith had adapted to a new world. One of the most disturbing discoveries came not from a conspiracy theorist or radical, but from a government clerk named Elsie Lang. In 1937, while auditing federal records for child welfare programs, she noticed anomalies: missing files, duplicated names, impossible timelines. More than 400 children had been transferred between facilities without legal guardianship, many of them vanishing from state databases entirely. Her curiosity led her to a defunct institution in upstate New York. Shuttered in 1919, but still receiving quiet maintenance funding. She broke in. What she found were sealed rooms filled with medical equipment decades ahead of its time, padded beds with iron restraints, and dozens of photo negatives showing children with dead eyes and forced smiles. In the center of the floor, drawn in chalk and never scrubbed clean, was the mark, the triangle and 3 dots. Elsie tried to report it. She brought her findings to a supervisor, then a senator, then the press. Within 2 weeks, she was committed to a psychiatric hospital for paranoid hysteria. Her official diagnosis included the phrase, obsession with non-existent cult activity. She was never released. But her notes, smuggled out by a sympathetic orderly, made their way to a fringe journal on institutional abuse. And from there, to the watchers who by then had grown quiet but not extinct. Her name was added to the carved list, her face remembered, her fate. Proof that the old rules still applied: tell the truth, and you vanish. But not always, because sometimes the truth leaks. Through cracks in paper, through whispers at night, through the steady, rotting heartbeat of history. The triangle waits, the watchers watch, and the ledger is never closed. The Second World War, with its death camps and mass displacements, offered the network both distraction and opportunity. While the world reeled from horror on an industrial scale, the old machine shifted gears. Under the fog of global atrocity, thousands of children went missing unaccounted for in refugee records, orphan registries, and transport manifests. Governments were too overwhelmed to notice. Charities absorbed them. Institutions processed them. The system didn't need to hide anymore, it just blended into the chaos. And for every child who was documented, 3 more vanished without a trace, absorbed into unnamed homes, medical trials, and special care facilities. It was the same story, this time with less resistance, because grief had worn people down into silence. Ashworth's name resurfaced in 1946, scrawled in the margins of a recovered intelligence file from a bombed-out Gestapo archive. The document referenced a man matching his description seen near a Catholic hospital in Vienna in 1939, speaking with staff about trauma protocols and symbolic markings. There was no record of who he was, no follow-up, just the note he knew more than he should. The watchers believed it was him or someone trained by him, whoever it was. They had left behind a hand-copied page from the original St. Catherine's ledger, hidden inside a hollowed-out Bible. The ink was fresh, the handwriting unchanged. By the 1950s, the network had gone corporate. It funneled its rituals into the language of grants, private foundations, psychological research. What had once been done in candlelight was now sterilized under fluorescent bulbs, backed by peer-reviewed journals and tax exemptions. Children were no longer just trafficked, they were studied, quantified, and modified. Certain programs within behavioral development centers showed disturbing consistency with methods documented at St. Catherine's isolation. Trauma inducement, language erasure, reconditioning, and once again. A few of the most successful cases bore the old symbol on their files, disguised as inventory marks or archival codes, but unmistakable to those who had been taught to look. The watchers adapted too. They began using radio. Subtle phrases slipped into shortwave broadcasts. Bookstores run by silent allies stocked texts with encoded indexes, leading those who asked the right questions to deeper truths. And always, the same line would appear at the end of each communication on postcards, etched on stone benches, whispered in hospital wings by patients no one could trace. We are still here. It had become more than a warning. It was a declaration, a resistance without uniforms, memory as rebellion, presence as proof. In the 1960s, the world dressed itself in revolution's civil rights, anti-war, liberation. But beneath the banners and marches, the old system kept evolving. It had learned how to exploit dissent the same way it once exploited devotion. Infiltrate, co-opt, redirect. A few radical child advocacy programs that emerged during this time were funded by shell foundations linked to names long buried in Ashworth's ledgers. These groups promised freedom, but delivered obedience under new language therapy, integration, conditioning. Some orphan wards in the Midwest began experimental reparenting projects, where children were isolated for weeks, stripped of identity, then rebuilt into new roles within elite foster circles. When questioned, officials cited psychological necessity. When pushed further, files were sealed or lost. Always. One of the few voices to speak against these practices was Dr. Harlan Reese, a child psychologist turned whistleblower who claimed to have witnessed structured emotional destruction in facilities receiving federal grants. He documented nearly 50 cases in which children exhibited the same behavioral symptoms as those once described in Ashworth's notes' flat effect. Ritualistic speech, unexplained aversions to religious iconography, and recurring nightmares about locked rooms. Reese was discredited quickly, accused of fabricating data, dismissed from the university, and found dead 6 months later in what was officially ruled a fall from a hotel balcony. But not before mailing his full report to a former student who would spend the next decade unraveling its implications. By the 1970s, the Watchers had gone underground entirely. They no longer passed information through printed material it was too easy to intercept. Instead, they returned to oral transmission. Families kept the knowledge hidden inside lullabies, prayers, Recipes coded language passed from grandmothers to daughters, from uncles to nephews. Some planted the triangle with 3 dots in embroidery, in quilts, in carvings passed off as folk art. Others burned copies of the ledger into their minds and taught only fragments to each child, ensuring no one person could reveal the whole story. The network wasn't just watched now, it was being shadowed. But with the rise of computers, new dangers emerged. Digitization allowed the old machine to clean itself, scrubbing records, rewriting pasts, deleting entire lineages. Foster histories were sanitized. Institutional abuse inquiries disappeared from public servers. Those who spoke up were now flagged, profiled, erased algorithmically rather than violently. The system didn't need fire anymore. It had code. Yet still, the watchers persisted. Not many, not loud, but enough, because every so often, on a park bench, in a thrift store, at the edge of a forgotten cemetery, a phrase would appear, scratched softly into the world like a breath refusing to fade. We are still here. By the 1980s, the machine had grown sleek, shrouded not in ritual, but in bureaucracy. Government agencies, adoption clearinghouses, and child welfare nonprofits operated like faceless monoliths. Their data anonymized, their transactions legal, but opaque. No one asked where the children went, only if the paperwork was complete. Most orphans now move through systems without ever touching a real family, foster to temporary care to residential treatment. A euphemism for containment. And through it all, those same surnames endured, now perched atop charities and law firms, speaking at banquets about the future of youth development. They had sanitized the past into talking points. But the symbols didn't vanish. They simply got better at hiding, folded into logos, buried in metadata, burned into microdots at the edge of adoption forms no one ever read. It was during this time that a discovery was made that nearly cracked the silence wide open. In 1987, a construction crew renovating a deconsecrated church in Massachusetts uncovered a sealed mason jar behind the old altar. Inside were brittle papers, Elizabeth Hartwell's original testimony from 1851. The writing was barely legible, faded by time and moisture. But the words still cut like blades. 24 beds, 24 shackles, 24 names never spoken again. The workers turned it over to local authorities, who claimed the documents were too deteriorated to verify. But someone leaked photographs of the contents. A reporter from a small regional paper published a story titled "The Academy Beneath the Altar." It lasted 2 days before being pulled from print. The reporter, Jane McKendry, was fired for fabricating history 2 years later. She was found in a psychiatric ward, unable to speak. Her room walls had been scratched bare. 3 dots, a triangle, again and again. It was proof, not just of what happened, but of what the system still feared. Hartwell's words had survived fire, silence, bureaucracy. And when her account reached one of the surviving watcher cells, now down to only a few elderly members, it was treated like scripture. They made copies. They memorized new fragments. And they added Jane's name to the record. Another soul devoured by the truth. Another proof that the silence wasn't just historical, it was enforced and alive. But what the machine hadn't counted on was the age of networks. Information now traveled faster than it could be erased. And for the first time since Ashworth vanished, fragments of the ledger began to resurface in places that couldn't be scrubbed. In the 1990s, the digital world opened a crack in the armor. What had once required ink and whispers could now be transmitted in seconds. anonymously, and to millions. The ledger, or pieces of it, began appearing on hidden message boards, scanned and distorted, embedded in zip files protected by layers of cipher. Most who found it dismissed it as creepypasta, the work of internet obsessives. But a few, especially those with roots in trauma, in social work, in the haunted corners of state bureaucracy, recognized the language, the rhythm, the symbols. One page, verified through forensic analysis of paper grain and ink patterns, matched the original documents seized in 1847. It listed 24 names, each followed by a word retired. The handwriting was unmistakable, Victoria Whitman's. It spread quietly at first. Archivists passed it through encrypted drives. Activists embedded the names in art installations, performance pieces, gallery walls. The triangle began reappearing in graffiti, subtle, scratched into the base of fountains or carved into the underside of park benches. Always the same dimensions, always paired with those 4 damning words. We are still here. Authorities dismissed it as urban legend, a spooky tale for the digital age. But inside government servers, flagged terms began to stack up. Watch lists expanded. Analysts started receiving briefings about persistent historical mythology infiltrating social discourse. What they didn't realize was that the story's power wasn't just in the horror, it was in the pattern, and patterns, once seen, can't be unseen. In 1999, a former child services employee named Marcus Hale released a 63-page document detailing what he called patterned procedural erasures within the foster care system across 6 states. He cited missing files, duplicate IDs, and children who were moved more than 20 times in a single year, only to vanish entirely before their 18th birthday. His data, dry and clinical, pointed to something deeper than neglect. It pointed to design, a system built to blur, forget, and absorb. He disappeared 2 months later, officially relocated under witness protection after a threat from an unnamed source. But unofficially, no one heard from him again. His apartment was stripped, his servers wiped, his plants left unwatered. Still, the watchers took note. Hale's last email, sent to a private mailing list of unknown origin, contained just 3 lines. They're still taking them. The pattern hasn't broken. We are still here. By the early 2000s. The story had fragmented into layers, part history, part myth, part digital folklore. It existed in the seams of the internet, never trending, never viral, but always there. On forums that discussed obscure architecture, users whispered about old orphanage blueprints that included sealed sub-basements never listed on official records. In gaming communities, modders built levels based on real-world locations tied to the ledger, where NPCs repeated phrases like, "They feed the altar," or "Mother never left." A few players thought it was fiction. Others traced the designs back to real, demolished sites. One of them, a teenager from Michigan, posted satellite footage of what looked like a labyrinth hidden beneath an old decommissioned seminary. 3 weeks later, his account was deleted. No warning, no archive. His username, BlackWarden23, became a ghost in comment threads, referenced like a curse, followed by only one reply. Still here, the institutions, meanwhile, had evolved again. They no longer needed to hide behind religion or reform. Now, it was care centers, rehabilitation camps, special education boarding programs. They recruited through court systems, schools, mental health referrals. Everything looked above board, licensed, sanctioned. But behind the curtain, it was the same ritual isolate: erase, rebuild, Survivors of these programs began coming forward in chat rooms and late-night radio interviews. Most were dismissed, ridiculed, or quietly discredited. But their stories matched details from the original St. Catherine's case down to the layout of rooms, the behavioral protocols, the reward-punishment cycles. One girl remembered being made to kneel for hours on salt-covered stone, reciting a hymn she couldn't remember learning. Another spoke of an inner room where no one came out the same, but couldn't recall what was done inside. Dissociation, conditioning, silence. A single leaked training video from one such institution, obtained by an anonymous source in 2007, showed a child being asked to draw the sacred symbol of gratitude during a reward exercise. He drew the triangle with 3 dots. When asked where he'd learned it, he responded, "The voice behind the mirror said it was mine." The footage was removed within 24 hours. The facility claimed it was role-play therapy, and the boy was highly imaginative, but behind the scenes, government inquiries were launched, then swiftly buried. The digital footprint scrubbed, but not before it was downloaded, not before it was archived. Because now, the watchers weren't just memory keepers. They were data miners, archivists, whistleblowers in the age of the algorithm. The ledger, once sealed in ash and whispers, had become a living document, fragmented, scattered, and yet more accessible than ever. And though most would never believe it, a growing number now carried the final verse like a code in their bones. We are still here. We never left, and we never forget. By the time the 2010s arrived, the ledger had evolved into something far more dangerous than paper. It had become a pattern recognition virus whispered through code, transcribed into sound, etched in motion graphics and alternate reality games. Not everyone who saw it understood what they were seeing, but once they did, they couldn't unsee it. The triangle with 3 dots began to surface in film concept art, in production design of seemingly unrelated television shows, even in the sigils of fictional cults written by screenwriters who swore they just made it up. But the coincidences were too exact. The angles, the spacing, the context always tied to manipulation, to silence, to children vanishing between acts. Somewhere along the line, the story had stopped trying to convince people it was real. Instead, it embedded itself in the culture like a splinter no one could pull out. A tech developer in Portland discovered that a deprecated government domain, once used by a defunct child welfare program, redirected to a string of IPs across Eastern Europe. IPs also used by dark web marketplaces known for their encrypted trafficking channels. He tried to publish his findings. 3 days later, he was arrested on unrelated fraud charges. His files disappeared. His co-developer disavowed him, claiming he'd fallen into conspiracy madness. But before his account was shut down, he posted a single line of code on a hidden forum. It translated to a GPS coordinate in Massachusetts' Gallows Hill. At the site, nothing remained of St. Catherine's, but fresh flowers had been laid there the night before, 24 white carnations, unmarked. Journalists, too, were catching on quietly. One freelance investigator, writing under the pseudonym Kane's Widow, began connecting missing children cases and foster programs to obscure, underfunded NGOs with ties to post-Vatican II religious revival orders. She traced one shipment of humanitarian aid from Boston to a remote compound in Brazil, where children were reportedly re-educated in isolation. She disappeared 6 months into her reporting. Her last blog post simply read, "If you're reading this, write the names in ash. Don't forget them. They're coming back, all of them. The watchers, now a loosely connected network of digital archivists, trauma therapists, rogue librarians, and former clergy, operated in shadows. They didn't try to shut down the system, they knew better. Instead, they illuminated the edges. They made the pattern visible. They taught people how to read the signs, to notice the void where a child should be, to hear the stutter in a story that doesn't line up, and in secret. They taught others the mantra, not because it would stop the machine, but because it marked them as part of the resistance. A phrase passed like a torch. We are still here. We see you now. The 2020s brought a new kind of silence, one dressed in convenience, in feeds and filters, in dopamine scrolls that flattened all things into entertainment. In a world addicted to distraction, the system found its most powerful ally, yet apathy. Deep truths, when wrapped in irony or delivered with memes, lost their edge. And so, the story of St. Catherine's, the ledger. The children. The Watchers was now just another tale in a sea of digital noise. Documentaries hinted, podcasts grazed the edges. But the moment something felt too real, it was labeled creepypasta or dismissed as ARG storytelling. The machine had finally done what it always wanted, made the horror palatable, made it fiction. But fiction has a way of waking something deep in the subconscious. A teenager on TikTok recreated the symbol in eyeliner across her cheek without knowing its origin. Another posted a video from an abandoned religious school where the walls bore faint carvings, triangles and dots etched behind a torn crucifix. He joked about it. The video went viral. But the comments turned strange. Dozens of users claimed to see a figure behind him, small, blurred, hovering just at the frame's edge. He deleted the video 2 days later. His account vanished a week after that. Still, mirrors of the footage remained, passed through encrypted drives like relics. Some claimed if you freeze the frame at 144, you could hear something behind the static retired. 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 The Watchers now moved differently. They didn't gather in basements or churches. They coded. They pirated data dumps from child welfare agencies. They restored redacted files, reconnected severed lineages, and used AI to rebuild erased timelines. A few created art haunting, symbolic, deliberately misinterpreted to slip truth into galleries and viral aesthetics. One series of oil paintings, exhibited under the name Echo of the Forgotten, displayed faceless children kneeling beneath stained glass windows shaped like the ledger's triangle. The exhibit traveled Europe. No one ever found the artist. But at each stop, someone left 24 candles on the gallery floor. No note. Just silence. What the system failed to understand was that memory itself had become contagious. The truth didn't need belief to survive. It only needed repetition, and in the cracks of songs, in the glitches of games, in the final breath of a bedtime story whispered by someone who remembered the pattern endured. We Are Still Here wasn't just a warning now. It was a spell, a resistance coded in myth, breathing through the ages, waiting for the moment the world was quiet enough to hear it again. Now, here we are closer to the edge than we've ever been. Surveillance systems catalog every heartbeat, every purchase, every scream too faint to register in the data stream. Algorithms determine which truths get buried, which cries for help become trending audio. The machine doesn't need to hide anymore. It's become the very air we breathe. And yet, in the quiet corners of that air, a different current moves. Not a rebellion of guns or banners, but one of memory, of names spoken in darkness, of patterns traced in candlelight. And still, always, The watchers remain not to win, but to witness, because in a world where the archive can be deleted at the stroke of a key, remembering is a form of defiance. In 2024, a seemingly insignificant academic paper slipped through the cracks buried in a database of religious anthropology, cited only once. Its title, The Doctrine of Retired Flesh, Sacred Disappearances and the Liturgies of Silence. The author, anonymous. But inside were scanned images of a second ledger, a different one. This copy listed not just the girls of St. Catherine's, but names from Brazil, Poland, Sierra Leone, Malaysia, 24 entries each, spread across centuries, continents, languages. The constants were always the same triangle: dots, fire, silence. The paper never gained traction, but it was downloaded over 3,000 times in its first month. Every download from a different IP, every IP linked to regions known for histories of institutional abuse. Someone was listening. Maybe everyone. Meanwhile, the phrase evolved again. No longer just, "we are still here." It fractured, reformed, coded itself into other expressions. The seed remains. The echo does not sleep. Ash remembers flame. A few believe these are the next cycle's mantras, adapted to avoid the filters, to survive in a world that polices thought more subtly than ever. Graffiti has re-emerged, not on walls, but in code, in blockchain hashes, in corrupted sound files, in digital watermarks that flicker for a single frame. Symbols that, once seen, imprint something ancient in the back of the mind. Not just fear, recognition. The final truth. This was never just about the 24 girls. It was never just about St. Catherine's. That was the doorway, the origin myth. What matters is that someone noticed, that someone wrote it down, and that someone, despite all odds, survived long enough to whisper it forward. Because in the end, memory is the only thing the machine cannot fully consume, the only altar it cannot desecrate. And as long as even one voice repeats it, the story cannot die. This is where it ends, or maybe where it begins again. The ledger, whether inked on parchment or rendered in fragmented code, was never meant to be a book. It was a mirror, a weapon, a haunting that refuses to fade. Those who found it didn't gain clarity, they gained weight, a burden of knowing. And now, that weight has passed to you. Maybe by accident, maybe by design. But either way, something ancient has now taken root inside you. Not belief, not fear. Something more dangerous, awareness. You'll see it now, everywhere, in a forgotten plaque outside a chapel that no longer hosts Mass. In the shape your coffee creamer makes in the lid before you stir it. In the repeated numbers on a case file that no one else questions. You'll hear it in nursery rhymes sung off-key by children who couldn't possibly know their origin. You'll feel it when you stand before an institutional building and sense the temperature drop by 2 degrees, just for a moment, just long enough to remind you that some walls were built not to keep people out, but to keep screams in. And when you try to explain it to someone, you'll see the look in their eyes, the reflexive shutdown, the nervous laugh, the denial disguised as reason. That's how you'll know you're not dreaming. That's how you'll know it's real. Because the story isn't trying to be told anymore. It's trying to be heard. The Watchers were never a secret society. They were always just people like you, ordinary souls cracked open by extraordinary patterns. People who lost something they couldn't name, then found the shape of their grief mirrored in 24 unmarked graves. People who lit a candle not out of faith, but out of fury. And now, you've been given the flame, You can snuff it, or you can carry it. But if you choose to carry it, understand this, you'll never again be able to say, I didn't know. That is the price of awakening. To walk through the world seeing not just its surface, but its rituals, its cracks, its altars, and behind those altars, the ledger, still open, still hungry, still waiting for someone to turn the next page. And when you do, you'll understand why the last entry simply reads, "We are still here, and now, so are you."